Hello, good morning. Good morning. We haven't done one of these in a little bit, but we're going to do a little Rockford reading. My fault. I have microphone problems. My fault. Okay, that should be good. We're going to do a Rockford reading. We're going to continue to read African Americans in early Rockford. I've never read this book besides the first little section that I had read, I think like a week and a half ago. But this is just done an effort to educate myself and educate other people watching this, and to gain more knowledge throughout Rockford's history. But I cannot speak on the goodness of the book or the content of the book yet. So I'm going to pick back up in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is called The Pioneers, Lewis Lemon and Isaac Wilson. Lewis Lemon was born a slave in Wake County, North Carolina in 1812, owned from birth by Orrin Lemon. He was living in Madison County, Alabama in 1829 when he was purchased from Lemon by, I always struggle with this name, is Germancius Kent for $450. In the winter of 1832 and 1833, Kent was determined to remove from Huntsville, Alabama to Galena, Illinois, and sold all his property in Alabama, including 3 of his 4 slaves. Lewis convinced Kent not to sell him and accompanied his slave owner to the north as a slave. In St. Louis, probably in January or February 1833, the 2 men entered an agreement by which Lewis would purchase his freedom from his owner. The terms of this agreement set the purchase price at $800. $800 to be amortized over 6 years and 7 months at 10% interest. Since Lewis had no money and no prospect of getting any, Kent's payment was Lewis's labor, valued at $15 per month. Lewis came to Galena with Kent later in 1833. And this was practice. No. I don't got no breakfast. I don't my fault. Don't got no breakfast. I'm saying we don't have any haven't had any breakfast yet. And this practice, though, about people that were slaves supposedly being able to buy back their freedom, was a practice that continued after slavery. It was something that was just a new loophole through slavery. Is these white plantation owners would give debt on Africans and place Africans in debt, then give them a small amount of money to where the money that they would pay them would never equal the debt that they owe, and the debt would keep growing, but the money would stay the same. So it was just a new way to trap people into this slavery and trap people into this work. So even in situations like this, where Lewis Lemon is still receiving $15 per month, you have to think that if $15 per month, and it's a set price at $800, but it's a 10% interest, Lewis Lemon probably never going to be able to pay that price. Or it's going to be very difficult for Lewis Lemon. Lewis Lemon going to have to save for an extremely long time. And this is a practice that went down throughout the country. In the summer of 1834, Kent met Thatcher Blake, and the 2 men made an exploring trip from Galena through the Rock River Valley, passing down the Pecatonica River into the Rock, going as far south as Dixon. Lewis accompanied them from Galena to Hamilton's diggings on the Pecatonica River in Wisconsin, then drove the wagon down to Galena, while Kent and Blake continued the journey. My fault. In August, the two men visited the area at the mouth of Kent's Creek. Kent liked it and determined to settle there. In September, Kent hired a gang of men, plus wagons and supplies, and returned to his claim, this time taking Lewis with him. From Galena, the party headed towards Dixon, as far as Chambers Grove, then went across unmapped territory to the Rock River. Lewis did the cooking and related chores for this group. In November, Kent and Lewis returned to Galena to spend the winter, leaving Blake and the rest of the party to the winter on Kent's claim. In April 1835, Kent brought his household to live in what would become Rockford. The first religious service within the future city limits of Rockford was held in 1835, conducted by Kent's brother from Galena, Reverend Aridas Kent, and Lewis a slave, and was one of the 11 people present. For some years, Lewis lived in the Kent household, and a glimpse of him in this period was provided by William H. Wilson many years later. Billy Wilson was a young man in his early 20s when he arrived in Rockford from New York City in August 1837. Employed by Kent as a clerk and surveyor, Wilson was badly homesick and returned to New York and the urban life after 2 or 3 years. City life suited him. He served as an alderman in New York, and in the Civil War was colonel of the 6th New York Infantry. In 1873, Wilson was invited to the Rockford Old Settlers Society. Reunion held at the Holland House on February 4th. He could not come, but wrote a letter full of recollections of his earlier time, which was read at the meeting. Of his Rockford friends of those days, Lewis Lemon was the one he remembered most vividly. In the Kent family was an old slave called Lewis Lemon, but more familiarly known as Dad. He was delighted to see the new white... Okay, before I read this, I do want to say this is a white man saying this. And there is no good form of slavery. Lewis Lemon still a slave during this time period. There are no good slave owners. There are none. And to say that Lewis Lemon was happy to be Lewis Lemon can be happy, but not happy in his position. I believe if you actually gave Lewis Lemon his choice, I don't believe that Lewis Lemon would stay to be a slave. Lewis Lemon would try to gain his freedom. Okay. He was delighted to see the new whitecomers, and in his employment as a steward, cook, and servant made us happy. Again, this is a slave we're talking about. Okay. As Dad was soon initiated into our friendships and became a bright particular star in our after movements, being sure to provide at our private feast from the best eggs from his master's barnyard and the finest milk from his mistress's dairy, while both master and mistress wonderingly declared it was very strange how poorly the hens laid, and how largely the cows fell off in their wanton supply. I imagine. I hear your voices as in olden days, again telling of the recent nights fishing on the river, the last hunt in the grove, or frolic at the store. We together break the seals of our last home letters and read aloud each other for the other's cheer, the loves and kisses that we find therein, while old Dad prepares a custard and mixes a punch, wherewithin shall be made glad the long hours of the night. I don't know what to say about that. Again, he's talking about his Lewis Lemon's employment. Lewis Lemon was a slave during this time period. It's not as if Lewis Lemon could have gone to HR and reported that, what the boss was doing, what the slave owner was doing. Lewis Lemon was a slave. Lewis Lemon didn't have no choice but to do these things. You can ask yourself if I can guarantee you, my fault, let me make sure his name is right. I can guarantee you, Jermaine Kent didn't treat Billy Wilson, who was his employee, the same as Lewis Lemon. Because Lewis Lemon was a slave. Another early Rockford settler who boarded with the Kents in the summer of 1837, Simeon Harmon, described Kent's double log house near Kent Creek and stated that Lewis accompanied the room over the kitchen at that time. The purchase agreement between the two men was fulfilled in 1839. On September 6, Kent drew up and signed a manumission paper freeing Lewis, which was witnessed by W.E. Dunbar and William Hewlin. Lewis did not remain long in the Kent household after this. See, that's just evidence in and of itself that Lewis Lemon was forced to do some of these things. The moment he got his freedom, he left the Kent household. There is no good form of slavery. At the time of the 1840 federal census, June 1st, 1840, he was living in the household of John Kemble, an attorney, also the home of the only other African American in Rockford, Isaac Wilson. Kemble became insane that summer, and his family returned to New York State, and Lewis had to make other arrangements. He may have found employment with Milton Kilburn at this time. On March 11, 1842, Jermaine Kent and Lewis Lemon appeared before Selden Church, clerk of the County Commissioner's Court, and registered the September 1839 manumission document. This document, plus an affidavit identifying Kent and a document certifying that Lewis Lemon was a free person of color, entitled to all the rights and immunities as such, were all filed with the county commissioners. This action was taken to comply with Illinois black laws, which required all freedmen to register with the commissioners and have certification of their status in their possession. But why was this done now, two and a half years after the fact? My fault, lost my place. 2.5 years after the act of manumission. There are several possible reasons for this. For one, perhaps they had merely put it off, but Kent was going bankrupt. Less than a year later, he lost all his property, and in the summer of 1844, he and his family fled from Rockford, never to return. As a bankrupt, All his property would be sold to pay his creditors. And since Lewis had for many years been one of Kent's, I don't know that word. I don't know if I can say that word. I think it's a slur. And since Lewis had for many years been one of Kent's slaves, it would have been prudent to have made. It would have been prudent to have a public record of his freedom. But perhaps the reason for this 1842 action was that Lewis had decided to leave the county, and he wanted to be in conformity with all the applicable laws when he did. It is likely that Lewis left the county, and possibly the state, not too long after March 1842. He is not recorded in the 1850, 1860, or 1870 federal census. Furthermore, on June 13, 1860, a pioneer festival was held in the city, attended by over 5,000 people, with special recognition being given to settlers in the county who had came before January 1st, 1837. The president of the festival was Thatcher Blake, the pioneer in the county who had made it his home as early as 1834. Orator of the day was Selden Church, who spoke at length on the earliest history of the community. Church remarked on Lemon's presence in Rockford in September 1834. An African man named Lewis, who had formerly been the slave of Mr. Kent in Alabama, but whom Kent had emancipated or sold to himself. No other mention was made of Lewis, who was well known to both Blake and Church. Furthermore, the earliest full account of Lewis's freedom was published in the 1869 Rockford City Directory. And here it is stated that Lewis remained in the county for a number of years after receiving his freedom. Despite this strong circumstantial evidence that Lewis was away from the county in this period, there is a short mention of him in the Winnebago County Chief of January 10, 1867. Lewis, who had formerly been the slave of Mr. Kent in Alabama, and who is now working on a farm for Mrs. Kilburn at Kilburn's Grove. This statement was made in a short history of the county written for the chief by the editor, J.P. Irvine. Irvine himself was a newcomer to the city, but he had contact with all its settlers, including Thatcher Blake. Apart from this mention, no trace of Lewis Lemon has been found in this period between 1842 and 1871. Wherever he was before, Lewis Lemon was living in the county by February 15, 1871, because on that date, he and 4 other men were voted membership in the Old Settler Society, which had been founded a year earlier. At the February meeting, a motion was made and carried that the admission fee. My fault. It's all these flies. At the February meeting, a motion was made and carried that the admission fee be remitted in the case of Lewis Kent. The admission fee was $3, and the annual dues was $1. It is clear that Lewis was poor on his return, as he had been when he had left. Lewis never formally took membership in the society, but this made no difference to the other members. At the time of his election, Lewis's old friend Thatcher Blake was president. In August 1875, the society held a picnic at the fairgrounds, and Lewis was introduced to the assembly by Anson Miller. The scene was reported. The scene was reported in the Rockford Register of August 27. Miller gave a speech on the early days and stated that in 1834, Thatcher Blake, Germainus Kent, and his slave Lewis Kent settled in Rockford on this side of the river. Mr. Blake and Lewis Kent are here today. Let's see. Okay, he is now 70 years of age, full of life and spirit, happy and, of course, free. He told us all that Germainus Kent bought him in Alabama. In the 1870s, Lewis lived at Kilburn's Grove, north of the spot where Kilburn Street makes a sharp jog at the northwest on its way out of Rockford. Here he had a small truck garden, the produce of which he regularly peddled around the city. In early February 1876, hold on, let me see. Okay. In early February 1876, he was interviewed by Robert Porter of the Gazette, who was writing an early history of the county. The results of this interview were reported briefly in the February 17th issue. During the interview, Lewis told Porter that he had lived as a slave in Winnebago County for 4 years and 4 months, which Porter garbled to mean Lewis had paid off his contract in that period of time, which he did not do. And if Lewis spoke of where he had been from 1842 to 1871, Porter did not print it. A careful reading of Porter's account makes it clear that Lewis had taken the initiative in securing his freedom, and that it was not merely the generous gift of Germainus Kent. Lewis died on the morning of Tuesday, September 4th, 1877. That afternoon, at 3 p.m., in the City Council chambers, a special meeting of the Old Settler Society was convened, where a resolution was adopted to take such action as might be considered necessary, and make arrangements for attending his funeral. As he died poor, the society will pay the bills incurred in having him respectably buried. Charles Works was appointed to take Charles Works was appointed to take charge of the funeral and appoint the bearers, etc. A short biography noted no more to our knowledge of him beyond the statement that he was unmarried. The funeral was held September 5th, attended by many of the old settlers, among them Thatcher Blake and Selden Church. Obituaries appeared in all 3 of the city's weekly newspapers, but new information is provided only in the Register of September 7th, where Lewis is called Lewis Lemon, better known as Lewis Kent. In states, he was generally and familiarly known at the time as Uncle Louis. The same source also states that Lewis lived in a small hut. Something on the page, but the Old Settler Society incurred various expenses at this time. At their meeting of January 21st, 1878, they received bills from A. Burpee, the undertaker, and Dr. Rowe, who attended Lewis during his last illness. These bills were deferred, and John Spafford and Austin Colton were instructed to ascertain whether Lewis Lemon left any personal property from which any money was raised or is likely to be raised. Apparently, he did not. Burpee's bills, covering coffin and hearse, was settled February 2nd, 1880, for $30, and Dr. Rohrer apparently canceled his bill, as no further mention of it was found in the minutes. Another expense the society incurred was that of the burial lot in the West Side Cemetery, now Greenwood Cemetery. At the February 1880 meeting, a committee was established to negotiate an arrangement with the Cemetery Association whereby the society would retain ownership of only the single grave and resell the balance of the lot to the association. The Cemetery Association was not receptive to this proposal, and references to it are found regularly in the minutes throughout the 1880s. No final action on the proposal is recorded, but records of Greenwood Cemetery indicate that on May 2nd, 1889, the deed to the lot was returned to the cemetery and canceled. Later, in 1952, the balance of that lot was finally sold to other parties. For nearly a century, Lewis Lemon's grave was unmarked. In the spring of 1976, a group of students at Wilson Middle School arranged to have a stone placed on the grave, with the inscription, "Born slave, died free. Lewis Lemon, 1812-1877, a founder of Rockford." And in 1993, the Rockford School District named Lewis Lemon Global Studies Academy in his honor. Isaac Wilson was born a slave in New York State in the fall of 1802. At the age of 6, he was given to Philip P. Fellers and lived with him near Hudson, New York, until he was about 21. At this time, he was sold to Colonel Potts, with whom he remained until after slavery was abolished in New York State in 1827. It seems likely the Potts family lived in Rensselaer County in the 1820s. Ike Wilson was assigned to a daughter of the Potts family. As her particular servant. At some point in the 1830s, the Potts family moved to Chicago, and Ike, now a servant to Miss Potts rather than a slave, accompanied them westward. Again, this might be a situation to where Ike didn't have no choice in this, that after slavery, the Potts family might have put an incredible amount of debt onto Ike Wilson, which made him not be able to go elsewhere, made him have to be enforced to be into this servant role. Basically just a new name for slavery, just a slight tweak to slavery. In Chicago, Miss Potts married John C. Kimball. Kimball, an attorney, had come to the West from Rensselaer County, where he had been a prominent man. His first wife had died in Troy, New York, in 1831, leaving him with 2 young sons. At that time, he was editor of a newspaper, the Troy Budget. But he entered politics serving as an assemblyman from his county in 1832. Then 3 terms, 1834 through 1836, in the state Senate. He resigned as senator May 22, 1836, and came west shortly thereafter. It is not known if he and Miss Potts had become acquainted in New York, After the marriage, Ike Wilson was employed as a servant by the Kimbells. John Kimbell came to Rockford early in 1837, the first attorney in the newly founded settlement, and for a few years was one of the prominent figures in this village. Lewis Lemon lived in the Kimbell household briefly after his emancipation in September 1839, and we may assume he and Ike Wilson were well acquainted. But in the summer of 1840, the household was suddenly disrupted when John Kimbell became insane. Mrs. Kimbell quickly decided to take her stepchildren, her demented husband, and herself back to New York, where John was institutionalized and where he died in 1843. Ike Wilson decided to remain on the frontier in Rockford. Wilson made his first money by selling apples. John Barker came to town in 1853, and he remembered. John Barker called Ike Wilson Black Ike. In that year, Wilson had a small store on North Madison Street. Ike was a character, Barker recalled. The arrival of the stagecoach was the event of the day in those times, and whenever the horn sounded, Ike appeared with 3 apples in each hand, ready to sell to the passengers, and he never carried back any rejected stock. Ike had been doing this for years. By the time Barker observed him in action. After accumulating a little capital, Wilson bought a small stock of groceries, and by 1850 had purchased some prime business property along the east side of what is now the 100 block of North Madison Street. On this property were 3 buildings: a frame store, a smaller frame store, and a brick house. His business has been variously described as a fruit and lunch counter, a fruit and cake store. He was also listed as a grocer. However his business may be described, he was the first successful small businessman of his race in the city. The 1852 Township Assessor's Book lists his merchant stock at $50 value, and his stock in trade at $200. Probably a reasonable evaluation of his typical holdings in this period. We know that he operated a bakery in his brick building. Personal property assessments noted that he owned a clock value at $4. Ike Wilson had worked hard and made a comfortable place for himself on the Illinois frontier. In October 1853, he advertised part of his property for sale in the Rock River Democrat. The brick house, situated between his shop and the American Hotel, and the lot on which it stands. The property, not surprisingly, sold in about 2 months. Like other successful men of his age, he hoped to be able to retire some from active life and live from proceeds of his investments. The Township Assessor's Book of 1855 reflects the shift in his finances. That year, his goods and merchandise were valued at only $15, but he had $800 in money and credit investments. Shortly thereafter, he found what appeared to be a suitable investment. In October, In the mid-1850s, there was just one railroad into Rockford, the Galena and Chicago Union, which had arrived in 1852. Business and farming interests had quickly come to believe another road was needed because they felt the monopoly charged unfairly high rates for passengers and freights. After some false starts, in 1856, a company was formed to build the line connecting Rockford with Kenosha, Wisconsin, running through Harvard, Illinois, where a good connection with Chicago could be made. Hello. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. You. Have a good day. Let's see. Okay, connecting Kenosha, Wisconsin through Harvard, Illinois. The project was enthusiastically endorsed, and many small businesses, and many small businessmen subscribed to this stock. Among them was Ike Wilson. Wilson's property on North Madison Street was very close to where the new railroad's Rockford terminal will be located. So good was the economic climate in the late 1856 and early 1857, and so enthusiastic were the supporters of the new project that financial prudence seemed a counsel of foolishness. We do not know how much money Ike Wilson invested in the Kenosha Road, as the new line was popularly known, but he may have mortgaged his property and put much of his ready cash in the stock. At this time, he found he could not give his usual attention to business, however. He married on January 4th, 1858. His bride's surname is not certainly known. She is called Mary Devane in the Rockford newspapers, but signed herself as Mary Williams on the marriage license application. It is possible she was kin to the Williams family that had came to the city at this time. They were married by Isaac Lyon, Justice of the Peace at the home of A.A. Fullock. Ike signed the marriage license application with a mark, which was witnessed by T.J.L. Remington, the county surveyor. Both newlyweds had considerably adjusted to do. Both newlyweds had considerable adjusting to do. He was about 54 years old, a quiet, frugal, lifelong bachelor, whose habits had brought him success. She was 20 years old, born in Maryland, and undoubtedly saw in her new husband an established man of means who could support her comfortably. Another contrast was that Mary had already traveled considerably in her young life, and must have seemed restless and adventuresome to Ike. He had been in Rockford for 21 years, and at the time of the wedding had not gone across the bridge to the west side for 5 years. His friends later stated he took a walk over town for his wedding tour. Not long after his wedding, however, events began to deal harshly with Ike Wilson. The financial panic of 1857, which began in September of that year, was the start of a period of economic depression throughout the North, which lasted until the Civil War. In Rockford, growth stopped. Business came to a virtual standstill, and many workers in the water power district were thrown out of work. The Kenosha Railroad was immediately affected. The Rockford Division, charged with building from Rockford through Harvard to the state line, ran out of money. In the fall of 1858, the Kenosha interest engineered a loan from the city of Rockford so rails could be purchased in the east. The loan was widely supported in the city, though there was some vocal opposition. And in 1859, work was finally again underway, after a delay of nearly 2 years. Since the road had no income, there were no dividends, and the financial situation required directors to make regular calls for payments on the subscribed stock. Many farmers and small businessmen found they had to take out mortgages to meet the payments. But many had raised money to subscribe to the stock by mortgaging their property in the first place. And they were forced into bankruptcy, losing all their property in the process. Ike Wilson was one of many who found that his investment did not generate income, but rather ate up all his ready cash and threatened him with destruction. In the midst of the worsening financial situation, the Wilson marriage was in serious trouble. In the Rockford Republican of August 5th, 1858, appeared the following notice. This is a newspaper? That's nuts. Whereas my wife Mary has left my bed and board without any just provocation, I hereby forbid all persons harboring or trusting her on my account. Oh, shit. Damn, he just put this in the newspaper. As I shall pay no debts of her contracting after this date. Isaac Wilson. Damn. Shit. Whatever the problems were that led to this situation, we do not know. But there was some sort of reconciliation achieved because Ike and Mary were back together by the summer of 1859. In 1859, Wilson's situation deteriorated rapidly, and the city was shocked when on June 29th, he tried to commit suicide by cutting his throat. Mary had left the house to fetch a pitcher of water, and in her brief absence, he made the attempt, being saved only by her timely return and quick action. Though he survived, and some hope was held for his recovery, it was clearly a serious and touchy wound. The account of the event in the Rockford Daily News depicts him as a nice, quiet, good, honest man, remarkably domestic in his habits, and noted that he had amassed quite a little fortune in his business, but that his property has been by some means become mortgaged and entangled in railroad speculations, which has so worn upon his mind as to induce, it is supposed, this attempt of suicide. The wound proved too much for his constitution. After lingering a month, he died early in the evening of July 30th. He was buried in Cedar Bluff Cemetery. His grave was never marked. And there was a large attendance of old settlers at the funeral. The Daily News reported he was perhaps the best-known man in Winnebago County. When he came here in Rockford, was but a name, but he has grown with the place and accumulated a little property, some of which has been invested in the Kenosha Road. It was noted, ironically, that the investment was a splendidly paying stock, as everyone is aware. The paper also noted another of Wilson's problem. Old Ike has had a troubled life of late, growing out of domestic troubles, and much sympathy was felt for him. On Tuesday, August 2nd, the same newspaper published a more complete account of Wilson's career after interviewing many of his friends and acquaintances. One of the interviewees could provide details of his life before he came to Rockford. James H. Fellers, a shoe merchant located in the 100 block of South Main Street on the west side, was the son of Philip Fellers, who had owned Ike Wilson for 15 years in New York State. The Daily News further elaborated upon the troubles at the end of his life. Owing to an unhappy marriage, he was less attentive to his business and used up most of his property. Until within the past year, he was noted for his industry and sobriety. For the past year, or at least 9 months of it, he has probably been slightly deranged. Ike Wilson was clearly liked and respected in the city, and the disintegration of his life in 1858 and 1859 was upsetting and fascinating. There was even an inclination to suspect foul play in his death, which probably focused on his young widow. A rumor went through the city that Ike had been poisoned. Wow. Took him out. A rumor went through the city that Ike had been poisoned, but a committee of physicians had made a post-mortem examination and laid the rumor to rest. Mary Wilson still lived in Rockford in June 1860, but apparently left the city at that time. Okay, I'm going to stop there. That's the end of chapter 2. I'm not sure what to think about this book yet, but we're going to keep reading. We'll finish it. Only a little over 100 pages. Oh no, like 150 pages. Okay. Well, we're going to pick back up. We'll be reading chapter 3 next.